Hello, everybody. It's a joy and privilege to welcome you all, panelists and attendees, to day number 3 of the Hacking HR Global Conference. And this is the panel, How is L&D Changing to Engage Employees in the COVID Environment? And just to get logistics out of the way, please keep an eye on the chat. Towards the end of the session, you will get the codes for the learning credits. At the same time, use the chat or the Q&A to drop us questions. We will do our best to pick them up as we go through the conversation. And let's make the most out of our time here today. A very, very quick round of introductions, and I will go through a short series of bios in the order on the banner, just so you know what is the flow. So first and foremost, we welcome here today Carrie Brown. Carrie is VP Workforce Adoption, SAP Evangelist and Thought Leader. She helps companies achieve organizational excellence with SAP to create value while becoming a best-run company. She is an international speaker and advisor on future of work, workforce adoption, change management and learning, interacting with diverse global occupational cultures and industries. Thank you very much, Gary, for being with us here today. Lara Martinez Gonzalez. Lara is a transformative leader in the areas of employee experience, talent management, and learning and development. She is the head of talent strategy and design at Alexion Pharmaceuticals, responsible for leading global talent programs to help people grow and develop while maximizing their impact. Good having you with us, Lara.
Thank you.
Next, we welcome Telly Schwager. Often referring to herself as not your typical HR person, Telly has a non-traditional philosophy and a maverick approach. She is empowered by the opportunity to make an impact on high-growth startups and loves learning from every moment. After a few years working in graduate recruitment and management, Telly joined Startup World and never looked back. She's currently the VP People and HR at CoinDesk. Good to have you, Telly. Welcome to Dr. Terry Horton, a workforce futurist, AI business strategist, and founder of Future Path. She is a future of work expert with expertise at the intersection of future of work, AI, organizational strategy, and people. She consults, coaches, trains, and provides strategies for organizations to thrive in the accelerated unfolding of the future of work. Thank you for accepting our invite, Terry, for today. And the award for Punchline Bio goes to Itamar Goldmeans. Welcome, Itamar. He simply presents himself as I solve human puzzles. Thank you very, very much for taking the time and curiosity and interest to join us. And let's dive right in. And let's start off with what are the key focus, the key trends that the pandemic brought into the spotlight within the area of L&D. And I will do a tour of the Zoom table. And I will ask Kerry if you can kick off the conversation.
Sure. So we had talked about, what's what's been getting on the L&D radar as a result of the pandemic. And there's a model, I'm sure we're all familiar with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, survival's at the bottom and, food and shelter, and at the top is self-actualization. There's another model for companies that's called the Ruhr's model and hierarchy. And it looks at it for corporations. And the same thing is true where people go from respond, recover to reinvent. And so I think that L&D has really responded in the same way for how people have gone through those changes. So if I look at what's really happened is things that we took for granted that were in the background came to the foreground. So we took for granted IT, we took for granted connecting with our peers. We took for granted a lot of the ways that we would communicate and share and learn in informal ways. And the spontaneity of learning in informal ways has gone away because we have to do everything. We have to even plan spontaneity now because there's not a chance for that to happen. So if I look at things that specifically got on the radar as I go through that, Organizations who had one location with 1,000 people suddenly have 1,000 locations. So we all became our own IT departments. We had to learn how to become our own TV production studios. So there's that, basic skill set. But I'd say also then the more human side of things was, how do we manage through change? How do we look at empathy? How do we also develop the capabilities around resilience? And so how do we listen and learn how to connect differently? So a lot of the agile type ways of learning and reinventing how we connect became other challenges for learning departments to think about. I can't get people for 8 hours anymore. I certainly can't get them for 2 days. How do I take programs that were, X chunk of time and make them 10% of that, because that's about the saturation point that we can really work through online or remotely. So to me, those are a lot of the things that really got put on the table for L&D, both topically as well as process-wise in terms of how to reinvent themselves.
Thank you, Carrie. Telly, would you add to that?
Thank you. I echo everything that Carrie has said. I would just say that in terms of an L&D experiment, the pandemic has basically thrown us into a sink or swim environment, whereby it's either, you adapt and you're resilient to the change, or, you are not. So it was like the momentous, challenge for us to either, learn and adapt or not at all. So that's what I would just add to everything that Carrie has said.
Thank you, Telly. Terry.
No, I again echo the perspectives of both Carrie and Tally. Now add, there's also a focus, what we saw emerge is a focus on socializing learning as well. And so with the advent of all of us being thrown into Zoom environments, really looking at how to drive sociability in that space and do so in ways that allow employees to connect with each other through the learning process. I think there also emerged really some of our fallacies or challenges too in the context of delivering robust, immersive learning experiences, which workers truly need today. Zoom fatigue is real, and the ability to deliver high impact learning experiences is definitely going to stay top of mind and a true focus if learning and development professionals hope to capture the mind share of learners.
Thank you, Terry. Lara.
Yeah, I think I'm echoing what all the panelists are saying. I think the focus on building community in a time in which you cannot be with the people that you work with directly, and creating that complicity that you create on a training environment that has been so complicated with the working from home situation is definitely something that I think Telly was saying, an experimentation area for all of us, and we have learned a lot fast and furious. So definitely many lessons that we could apply to evolve L&D much more beyond the pandemic itself.
Itamar.
Yeah, don't know if I have much to add, so I'll offer maybe a synthesis a little bit. I think if I kind of reflect on what Carrie and Tally and Terry and Lara have shared, I think we've all kind of observed shifts around 3 big axes. One is really about like the skills that we're focusing on and a growing need for offering support and training and development around a new set of skills. The other one is really working our way around this new way of delivering learning experiences. And then finally, and maybe that's something that we may double click on a little bit later in the panel, but really also working and delivering learning this way, creating an opportunity for us to really expand the audience of our learning experiences and potentially reach places in the organization that for which structured learning experiences were not available before and are now.
Thank you very much. Carrie, back to your point on new topics that made their way into the L&D agenda. I would ask you to start us off into the next bit of our conversation, and if you can guide us a little bit around what are the new skills that made their way onto the learning and development agenda.
If I look at the new skills for L&D itself, I think is some of what we talked around earlier of how to reach people when you don't get to be near them. So, I think for L&D, they've had to take, and accelerate. If you look at all the different kinds of learning and the different modes of learning and vehicles, some of those that were, for some companies, it didn't feel like, look like, sound like work, that were more virtual, more social. To Terry's comment around, how do you socialize learning? I think the L&D community has had to become much more nimble and embrace different forms of learning that they might have been dabbling with, and now it is the only medium by which they can reach people. I'd say also the consideration around for organizations where remote isn't the only aspect of it, but if you're looking at organizations that have had people on site, in frontline, in manufacturing settings where they might have had to bring in new people. So as a given person has had to face a positive test and a whole shift of workers comes off. So organizations have had to do mass recruiting, and a lot of onboarding, I think, has really become a challenge for L&D to say, how do we give people exposure to entirely new jobs when the traditional forms of introduction to an organization have gone away. And then I'd say also is, support of people. So just general support in terms of learning has become, relies on all those same new methods. I'd say for individuals, for employees, it's how to manage time, how to manage communication, how to manage your own learning, because it's we're really, a business of one a lot more. I think the rhythms have changed with everyone using Teams, using Zoom, whatever vehicles they have. For organizations that don't have those, even more handicapped in terms of how they can connect and learn and grow. It's funny, I had a landline and I used to use it in order to do phone calls. I never use my landline anymore because now I talk on the computer all the time. And so, you look at just the habits, things that you did in the before times that now have become just the natural part of your day. I think we've all become much more, the company of one, where we have to look at how to manage our school, our family, ourselves, our work, our lives, all in one place with a different rhythm than we had before. I think the challenges for everyone then is also thinking about, when does the day start? When does they stop? How do I create and have informal learning? I think is probably the biggest challenge. Informal learning now is much more reliant on what I see in an article or a blog and that kind of informal learning, rather than peer-to-peer type learning, which was typically a big part of on-the-job experience and growth.
I'll add to that and say one of the foremost skills that learning and development professionals need to develop or embrace or enhance, and that is the skill of foresight. If we think about statistics in the context of what the workforce will look like in 2030, 2025 and 2030, we know that it'll be 75, 80% millennials and Gen Z with some alphas mixed in. And if we look at some of the current data today, what we do know is that the top of the list for millennial and Gen Z workers is professional development and career development. So we need to have enough foresight to not only prepare the employees with the skills that they need to do the job efficiently and accurately, and provide them with training that enables them to work side by side with robots and algorithms, but we also need to have an eye for the future so that we're preparing them with the skills that they will need in the future. And in my view, also infusing learning around data analysis, visualization, and AI fluency in every aspect of training, regardless of the department.
100%. I'm just going to jump into the question that we got on, the need for managers to figure out how to engage teams remotely. 100%. If I look at, no different to kids at school, and for anyone who's got kids, that some have teachers who've been great at engaging their kids, and some have teachers who aren't. We all have managers, some who are great and some who aren't, and the creativity factor's got to go up. We did a session actually earlier today with our organization where we did a Q&A with executives, and I thought this was fantastically creative. We had all the Q&A done by people's kids. So we seated actually the children of people around the company to ask the questions on behalf of the adults, and it changed the rhythm, it changed the tone, and it made it far more engaging than just yet another report out on what was going on at this point in the organization and quarter. but yeah, it's creativity's high.
Anyone would like to build more on this topic?
Yeah, maybe adding as well a couple of things that have emerged very powerful this year in terms of topics for L&D. Definitely working remotely, managing distributed working teams has been top of mind for many of us. This piece about resilience, how do you build your own resilience on yourself? How do you build resilience on your team to help you take care of yourself in a time that has been extremely challenging for many other people and for yourself? And then the last one, two more, I think, in terms of agility and being able to course correct and move ahead and reprioritize and deliver value when you don't know what's going to happen. I think Agile is here to stay. We will see much more demand on that in the future. And then finally, diversity, inclusion, and belonging with everything that happened, especially in the US with the Black Lives Matter movement and all of that, that's also here to stay. So we will see much more demand on those type of topics in the future.
Maybe one final bit that I'm not sure was brought up, but definitely becoming more and more present. Kind of like to tie it into the manager comment. The other skill area is around effective meeting management and facilitation. As we are moving towards a more hybrid way of working that's partly asynchronous and partly synchronous, I think there's a growing emphasis on making those synchronous experiences as effective as possible, knowing kind of like being well aware of our scarce attention resources. And this is another way where learning and development can sort of have a meta benefit or kind of like a second degree effect by demonstrating how we can create incredibly effective online virtual synchronous experiences. Just by participating in the learning experience can give managers a lot of fodder, ideas, creativity, as Carrie had mentioned, that they can bring into other contexts in which they're bringing people together, not necessarily with a pure intent of learning together.
Thank you, Itamar, for bringing up the online bit into our conversation. And I would like to ask you to lead the conversation forward. How is the virtualized environment shaping L&D, and how is the virtualized environment driving the learning experience?
Yeah, it's a really really good question, and in some ways it's like every big change. I think it's a bit of a blessing and a bit of a curse. I think on the plus side, as we've briefly alluded to, and I think some of my other panelists here are going to expand on as well, being able to deliver learning virtually really democratizes learning in a way. It makes it a lot more accessible to more people in the organization. Hopping in a Zoom call is a lot easier than joining an in-person workshop that may or may not be happening where I live or work, right? Carrie had mentioned sometimes it was a half day or a full day or multiple days. That's a massive commitment. Whereas if I now can jump in on a bite-sized 90-minute, highly dense session, I get a lot more bang for the buck, and it's something that I can commit to in my very busy schedule. And second, there's a real plus sign and a real opportunity in this disruption of the traditional ways of delivering learning experiences. Terry mentioned this earlier as well. It opens the door for us to catch up with the last decade of pedagogical research, right? The science of learning, and create more effective experiences. For example, we are starting to see the shift in virtual learning from this single person recorded learning experience to this cohort-based live interactive experiences. And that's the path forward and a huge opportunity. But on the downside, I would say, as a profession, my perspectives, my panelists may very well disagree, but I would humbly say that on average, we are lower on the mastery curve in terms of delivering effective learning experiences that are not in person. We're still figuring out the best ways to combat Zoom fatigue. We're still figuring out how to flawlessly execute on cohort-based learning. So I think it's going to take a little longer to reach true mastery here. But when we do, I'm very confident that we'll be able to create a much more effective learning experiences that the ones that we were able to create in person.
Thank you.
Itamar, I'll echo that. One of the things we talked about around an initiative that we're working on is, how do you get the Netflix experience where that continuum of learning is like the continuum of information from the trailer to the content to a follow-up, which becomes part of the rhythm of what you do and has some pull as well as the push. There's definitely a switch and a change to that. And it goes, I think, to some of the questions when you say about how do we take new methods in our Q&A. There's a question on, what do you think is going to stay? What do you think is what was accelerated, which I think we've answered, but what do you think is coming differently? And Terry, I'm curious your perspective when you look at technology. The question was, do we think VR, for example, will see an increase? It's interesting. I know some folks who lead a VR company, and they saw a huge drop off initially because people were afraid to touch and share devices. And so the cost consideration around device safety and cleansing and so forth, now that's changed, but you can give a completely different experience virtually, which, given that technology is more accessible, you can potentially actually have a greater exposure and opportunity than you would have had otherwise. So I'm curious, Terry, how you see that really fitting in as well.
Thanks so much, Carrie. Yeah, one of the things that we do know for sure is that in the context of futuristic technologies and AI-based technologies, virtual reality is at the top of the list for learning and development in terms of creating and delivering immersive learning experiences. I'm excited about the fact that L&D and learning is moving beyond. You think of I think T-Mobile is an example of a company that uses VR in training to help in the event that a store is robbed, or it's used in the context of, let's say, if you're a journeyman lineman, you build power lines and using that, or even in policing. There are a lot of opportunities to move VR into the space, particularly when it comes to teaching empathy and resilience. And so VR, mixed reality, definitely at the top of the list. I think the other part of this is that, to Itamar's point, we can bring all the technologies into the space that we want to. If we don't have the fluency as leaders to be able to deliver that immersively, it all goes by the wayside. The other piece to that too is that we've got to be able to look at how we deliver a high level of energy in these spaces. These spaces are flat, whether it's exciting with music as the learners come into the learning in the Zoom environment. It needs to be more spectacular. We learned a lot from the events industry about how they acclimated to online and virtual events versus in-person events. I think there's a huge opportunity to leverage some of that learning in L&D as well.
Yeah, from my perspective, our company did an offsite all in VR, and it was so cool because I got to engage with a colleague in Russia, but in my living room. And it was just such a powerful experience because we had that interaction that was more personal than just on a regular Zoom meeting. And so that learning and development that maybe we would have received it in a synchronous environment in person, we were able to glean from that virtual reality environment. But also I think there's an aspect of L&D that we are getting right here, right now, right? Like, we're part of a virtual event, but I'm learning from all of you. And I'm, getting information that I would have otherwise not have received had I not participated in this event. So it's I think it's so wonderful that we can have these environments where we can learn and grow without having that Coursera or LinkedIn Learning, module 1, module 2, TICA test, yeah, you have a certificate, but rather, just getting various perspectives from experts in the field is something that I think is going to happen more and more often, and going to be successful in terms of L&D for individuals.
Ali, I think it's really interesting. There's a question that came in on face-to-face interaction provides a multi-sensory experience in presence of others. How might that impact younger generations as they start their careers in more digital interactions? What do you think about that?
I think it can be a blessing and a curse because sometimes digital interactions can be a little, how do I say this in a nice way? Can be a little on the insensitive side because they are digital interactions, and that humanness is kind of taken away from them. So I think that encouragement of mindfulness and intentionality in those interactions is really important. But I think, yes, we are going to go digital. Like, I think in the future, like, people aren't going to want to turn their cameras on Zoom almost. Like, they're going to want to find a different way to interact with one another. So maybe I don't have great foresight on this, but I do think that there's going to be different means of interacting because, yes, Zoom fatigue is real. I think there are going to be hybrid or remote first environments completely. So there's going to be various digital means of interacting. It might be in VR world. Yes, this is the success of Clubhouse. Absolutely. I see somebody wrote that in the chat. And I think we're going to see more things like Clubhouse being innovated in the future so that we can interact with one another within the guardrails of being sensitive to, what we say in a digital presence.
In a previous lifetime or a previous chapter in my career, I was part of a pretty progressive school. And I remember one of the things that I was really blown away by, especially from a pedagogical perspective, is the increased emphasis on socio-emotional learning from a very early age. And I used to joke at the time that almost all of the people challenges that we are encountering in work are as a result of us not getting the necessary foundation in basic socio-emotional skills that sometimes 6-year-olds get nowadays. So I'm optimistic that I think the education system is going to catch up and maybe fill in some of the gaps in the world of work. But I also think that learning and development experiences are going to be more oriented towards offering more mature folks additional support around socio-emotional skills so that we can deal with this maybe oversimplification or the limited amount of inputs that are available in a purely digital experience.
I think if I can summarize a bit what I was listening, I think like the two things that came to my mind is the first one is balance, making sure you're balancing the experience with the needs, with the users, and also diversity, right? We have discovered so many new tools and things that we can do, but one way is not the solution that is going to work for everything, right? Like trying to identify when you have to create a community, when you have to do this soon, like in the future, once we go back to the space work. I think the diversity and balance is going to be critical to extract the essence of what we have learned and make it productive for all our diverse population of users.
Lara, I would ask you to start making a little bit of a light around what shifts in audience have we witnessed over the last months.
Yes, I think it was Itamar who was talking about democratization of learning, in which we now have the capacity to reach out to populations that maybe in the past were not as reachable. If we think about people in manufacturing floors and stuff like that, I think sometimes they were a bit of the forgotten side for certain type of trainings, and now we are tackling into them thanks to the virtualization of the learning. But I do think as well that the critical actor on all this process have been like managers and leaders, because they have been the ones who were trying to manage the team in a completely uncertain environment. And I think that has been out of focus in how do we upskill our managers and our leaders to be managers and leaders when we don't know what's going to happen and when we cannot see people that you are responsible for. So I think from my perspective, that was one of the biggest shifts on the audience. Happy to any other thoughts from my panelist friends.
I'm curious, there's a question in the Zoom, and it goes back to some of the comments that have just been made. How do we manage different learning styles with online learning, especially in Zoom? I'll share my experience so far. I've done a lot of work in the last year. I had just started dabbling in it at the start of COVID, but have done a ton more work using Mural. And I don't know if you're familiar with Mural. It's a free tool. I'll type it in the chat in a minute. But it allows you to brainstorm and have the experience of being in a room, whiteboarding and interacting, both synchronously and asynchronously. And I think that really speaks to the question not only of different learning styles, but also of different people styles. So introvert, extrovert, these kinds of forums invite in more of the extrovert. I'm an off the charts extrovert, so super easy for me. Challenge for me is actually making sure I make space for others. But recognizing that 40% of the world are introverts, we need to give them a chance to play too. So the way that we've had events be successful that are learning and creating that interactivity is through the use of breakout rooms along with Mural, where you're giving the independent, focused, quiet time to work on something for 5 minutes and then share and have the same kind of facilitated experience that you might have together that changes the cadence from one speaker, many listening, to a more interactive scenario. What I will say is, at first, it feels super intimidating. First time you use Mural, it feels super overwhelming. Within about 15 minutes, not bad. But it feels a bit awkward. And when we were doing breakout rooms with 5 different breakout rooms and different canvases and all that, at first it felt like a whole lot of moving parts, and it does take a bit more prep up front, like any learning event. But I think it speaks to some of the needs around both learning style and personality style in terms of giving different experiences. And Itamar, I see you nodding your head, and Terry, I'm curious both of what you're thinking on that.
I want to build on the point that you made about learning events. I think if we think about the learning experience moving forward, they should be events. They should be widely orchestrated with a lot of moving pieces, a lot of interactivity, a lot of motion. And I think that's a mind shift for L&D professionals too. We deliver events. We are the deliverers of immersive learning events, and to capitalize on the technologies that are available and platforms that are available to help us do that.
Yeah, and I would build on these two comments and say, yeah, one of the promises of this virtual medium is that it allows us to curate the experience in some ways, sometimes even easier than we could in the physical environment. Like Carrie's example around breakouts is fantastic, right? Like this is something that I can do with like 2 clicks of a button online. I can be a lot more intentional about group design if I want to. In the physical world, it's going to take forever, right? Or just sort of like reshuffle the space. And so there's a real promise of actually creating a more personalized experience that's more suitable for multiple learning styles online, if we are being thoughtful about it and if we're bringing the whole set of tools into the equation. Tali mentioned earlier the growing prominence of audio, right? Like that's another really interesting tool that's available for us and becoming more and more popular. I want to touch on one other aspect from a question that was asked in a Q&A around doing this work in hypergrowth and avoiding becoming too siloing. And again, like this is where the democratizing of the virtual experience can be really incredible and effective. It would be incredibly costly to bring people from different teams that are not co-located in the past to a shared learning experience. Whereas now it's really a matter of just putting them on the same Zoom, right? Or in the same breakout room. So huge opportunity to use learning experiences to indirectly break organizational silos by being thoughtful about the cohorts that we're creating and who is going on with us in the learning journey.
Terry, I would like to pass the mic to you next and ask you what excites you most as you look into the future, especially through the L&D lens.
What excites me the most is that there is a brighter lens being, in a brighter light, if you will, being shined on L&D, and that is learning and development and skills are the new currency. And then if I really take that and extend it a bit further, there's an opportunity for L&D to be positioned as the premier aspect of an employer brand. And that goes back to thinking about, excuse me, goes back to analyzing the needs of potential employees. So that's millennials and Gen Z, what's at the top of the list for them, learning and development and career development. And so I'm excited about the fact that there's an opportunity to push L&D forward as a tool of attracting and retaining top talent. I'm also really excited about really dynamic collabs, like collabs between World Economic Forum, Coursera, Salesforce, LinkedIn of sorts, Red Thread, Burning Glass, that are coming together to really create some fantastic data around skills, learning, and mobility. And so we now have access to partnerships like that. We have access to the data and the output that comes from collabs such as that. And so figuring out the skills that are required for today and at the future can be daunting at best, but we now have the skills, the capabilities, and the platforms and access to that information to make learning extraordinarily dynamic. And from my view, more importantly, to prepare workers not just with the skills that they need today, but to be able to do that dynamically and deliver and provide them with and enable the learning they need for the skills that they'll need either with the organization or outside of the organization in the future.
Anyone else looking into the future and feeling particularly inspired and excited?
I think that where we are right now is a super huge gift to all the people in the space that focus on people. If you look at, just people in general, we're part of a cog in the wheel of organizations where, yes, there were priorities on culture, there were priorities on development, there were priorities on D&I, there were priorities on all of the things that are part of the fabric of organizations. But the dependence and the vitality of organizations was disrupted so much when people all went home, or some went home and some couldn't go home. And so I think the optimism I have is everyone is paying more attention to learning now. There was an article I did on learning recently, and it was, one of the points I made is every single person from the CEO on down to the individual contributor in every company had to learn something in the last year. No one could rely on what they used to know. It wasn't enough. And so the appreciation for the importance of learning, the need of learning, what people's needs are, is much more top of mind. And the collective experience we've all had makes it true for everybody. It wasn't just you, it wasn't, but it's you, your neighbor, your family, your friends, your coworkers. Everybody had to learn how to adapt and grow. And frankly, the super positive part, we were enormously successful at it. If you look at, take higher ed, so learning as a discipline, as an industry, if you were to talk to them in mid 2019 and said, could you take your entire program remote? There would have been mutiny. No way, no how, not possible. They did. Is it going to stay that way? There was a question on hybrid work and a question on learning. I think everything is going to find a mixed answer. I think it will be a hybrid answer. I think there are some cultures where they may say we want to go back and be in person, but there'll still probably be different flexibility. I was speaking to somebody yesterday. Why would the world at large proceed to get into cars and sit in long lineups to go and be in a building at the same time every day, and then at the end of that day get in a big long line known as rush hour to do the same thing? When organizations now are going to need to look at why do we meet, how do we meet, how do we learn, when does coming together give that socio and experiential learning or experience that is really valuable, and when isn't that needed? So I think that the big win is we've disrupted, and with disruption comes opportunity, and the appreciation for what everybody on this call speaking and participating does has grown tremendously.
Thank you, Kerry. Lara, I saw you unmuting yourself.
Because I was going to connect with Terry, but I think with what Kerry was saying as well, it both connects about focusing on the future, right? Like whatever we're going to do from an L&D perspective has to be thinking about what are the skills that we're going to require, knowing that may change. So, because we don't know yet anymore, right? But starting to focus much more on designing for the future and building learning experience about the skills that we're going to need. And someone was asking on the chat, like, what about the balance between hard skills and soft skills? I think this year has definitely bring the soft skills to the forefront a lot as well. So as I was mentioning earlier, I think it's that balance of is finding the right balance and making sure that we are aligned with the future and where the organization wants to go.
Thank you. Before we pick one very interesting question in the Q&A regarding how do we measure effectiveness and impact of learning, I would like to ask Telly, with 20 minutes remaining into our conversation. This is very painful to say. Telly, could you please pioneer answering the question of one actionable step that you would all recommend people to take after the Hacking HR conference starting Monday morning? What would be your number one recommendation?
Sure. And maybe this is more personal than professional. So apologies if that's not the answer people were looking for. But I think L&D doesn't come in one form in any shape or form. I think it comes in many ways. Oh, thank you, Carrie. I'm honored. And like, I don't know if you can see the artwork behind me, but like, I did not know how to paint last summer. And I just forced myself to expand my comfort zone. Thank you, Carrie, again. And I think it's all about expanding your comfort zone. And if there's one thing that you've ever wanted to try to, I don't know, post something on LinkedIn that you were nervous about posting publicly, expand that comfort zone. Just to, challenge yourself to do so, and then feel the fulfillment that it gives you by doing that and taking that leap of faith in yourself, because it is quite fulfilling. So that would be my 2 cents there.
Thank
Kelly,
you.
I started hydro gardening as well as a new hobby, to your point, and I do love your artwork as well. I would say one of the top of mind for me for learning and development professionals is to start immediately laying out a plan for how they will become more AI fluent. What do I mean by that? Much of the work in L&D moving forward will be hyper focused on data as we humanize the learning experience for workers and we create personalized learning and all of that. You've got to have some AI fluency to fundamentally understand how these systems work. You've also got to have a fundamental understanding of the systems and programming and data science so that you can ask the critical questions around the effectiveness of these platforms. And so the key actionable step for me that I make for everyone that's listening, begin the process of building out your own learning around AI fluency and data science. Completely underpin learning and development moving forward.
Thank you, Terry. Carrie, I saw you wanting to jump into the conversation earlier.
No, I was just sharing that, if I look at the ways that people are going to learn and the changes that they're having, for me, I think as much as anything, it's not only think about what we learn, but what we unlearn. And so, when I came into 2020, what I was going to unlearn was to unlearn using paper to take notes and use my iPad so that I would have a way to capture it better. I have to say, I have returned absolutely to my piece of paper because it sits beside me. And the reason I was getting away from writing it was I'd write in one little book. And then what do I do with all those little books when I'm remote? I don't have access to all those little books everywhere I go. And that was my reason for doing it. I've failed abysmally at that, but I've learned a whole bunch of new other things. So I think the opportunity is also for us to think about what habits we have that we want to break around learning in order to create some more space for resilience, create some more space for open-mindedness about doing things differently. You can see a whiteboard behind me. I didn't have a whiteboard in my home. I took on a new role at our organization and I couldn't fit the things I had to learn on paper. And I didn't have access to a room where I could go do that. I don't really want a whiteboard in my house. I hope one day that I can go back to not having it and give it to a charity and then let them take advantage of their school. But I think it's figuring out how to unlearn as well as learn and try new things, exactly that, like Tally and Terry were sharing, either personally or professionally. I learned to make bread. I'm going to make some hot cross buns. Like there's, tried to do things that I have time for. And I think the hard part is many of the things that we would do to learn, we would typically go and do with others. So it's the creativity of doing hydroponic gardening or doing painting where we can do things alone that, I had a friend come over who's taken up painting and we did painting together, socially distanced outside. Not something I would have normally done. So I think it's also thinking not only what we learn, but what we can unlearn too, is my thought on that.
Yeah.
Great point.
And
Thank you.
building up on this notion of unlearning, I think kind of a lot of the things that we've talked about is sort of an opportunity to unlearn maybe some of the assumptions or the misconceptions of we have about what a learning experience is, right? That it happens in a classroom, that it happens in person, that it is a standalone container for learning that is different from doing work. So look for those new small opportunities to start small with something new. How can you introduce something small in the flow of work, not necessarily like in a learning container that is going to just encourage a little bit more reflection? How can you use some of those new tools like a breakout or like a digital whiteboard to just drive new insights, right? Like learning and performing, we tend to make this distinction, but oftentimes they're really like embedded in one another on two sides of the same coin. So look for opportunities to unlearn some assumption around what learning is and what learning should look like and experiment with that.
Yeah, and building on that, because you just triggered something, right? Like, how do we build learning into our day-to-day? Like, for example, during the pandemic, I started to learn to podcast, and I'm learning to podcast while I'm cooking, while I'm like clean the house, whatever, right? So that's like, instead of saying like, oh no, I have to dedicate a full day of training because that's my space for learning. How do we change that mindset? How do we unlearn that, as Kerry was saying, and we actually see opportunities for embedding learning into everything we're doing, like going to work or or everything within our day-to-day. Yeah.
I'll add to an opportunity to infuse when we think about assessing learning as well. I think there's an opportunity to teach creativity through the process of assessing. And so, embedded into the training, how can we creatively have the learners solve a problem that utilizes a high level of creativity outside of that space, that also infuses technology and requires that they are resilient as they solve the problem and display it.
With a few minutes to allocate, going back to the question in the Q&A section, how do we define success with all these changes that we touched on, and how do we measure it?
I think there's a number of ways. It's interesting. I was sharing, I took on a new task. We are shifting how we are managing the customer experience as we move further and further to cloud. So we are more embedded in the day-to-day lives of our customers as we spend more time in cloud. So we're shifting how our employee journeys support that customer journey. And as part of that, I'm doing what I refer to as drinking our own champagne and using all the solutions that we have that measure employee experience and listening and looking at the process adherence. I just put a note in the chat around that to understand what's happening within a process, what the experience is for the employee, what is happening in the actual business process. So combining both the experience information and the process information in order to see where's there a gap in the process that there's an opportunity for learning, and how do you weave in not only the information, but the data on the employees and what they're working on, where their challenges are, hearing from them and seeing where the business is working. Because honestly, the reason we learn at work is to get a better outcome at work. The reason we learn to paint and we learn to do gardening is for our own fulfillment and for our own brain candy. But at work, we're learning to really be effective in our jobs. So I think in terms of data, there's a plethora of it, but looking at how to listen to it and learn from it and catalog it in the same way as we do when we look at how to do financial analysis or marketing analysis. We can do that same kind of focused effort to get the same insights on people and how to support them as they work.
Yeah, I see a kind of Carrie's point and Terry's like huge emphasis on AI and data science kind of like getting combined here, right? Because the answer for like how do you measure learning in some ways like still points to the good old Kirkpatrick model, right? Like I think that's still true today in the virtual environment as it was in the physical environment. But what we do now, or what we have now, is the opportunity to just operationalize it a lot easier, right? It's a lot easier for me to go into like Zoom statistics and like see who actually showed up for the training, much more so than relying on calendar invites or in taking attendance in class. And so all of these different steps in that model that were just incredibly hard to instrument in the physical environment become just a little bit easier in this more digital virtual environment. And this is one of the key promises that I see here as well.
Just answered a question in the chat in the event that anyone else has the same question. And the question was, where do I go to learn if I'm going to even start the process of developing AI fluency? Where can I get that? And so I have a few recommendations. Number one, Coursera has a data science course for managers. It's sponsored by IBM. Fantastic. Microsoft also has their AI business school, and it's broken out across categories, and it's really helpful, all of which are free. And one that will be really helpful too is AI for Everyone. It's on Coursera, and it's delivered by Dr. Andrew Ng. He's the brain behind Google's AI strategy. There are also micro-credentials. I have one from MIT, which is, I think MIT is the #1 in the country for this AI business strategy certificate, followed by Georgetown. But you can get micro-credentials in AI business strategy. And I can speak for the MIT program. It was absolutely fantastic. And you don't have to be a data scientist to begin it. You can, the coursework meets you where you are.
Thank you all. There was a very interesting point raised in the Q&A, and Carrie already answered it there, but I think it is worth bringing it into the wider conversation regarding what role do learning and development people and learning and development as a function play in driving organizational change. And we have some minutes to touch on this, because it is
I'll expand on my comment, and then I'd welcome everyone else to jump in. If there are not any resources specifically invested in or dedicated to managing change, then yes, I'd say learning is the primary and often the primary vehicle by which to influence new behaviors and skills, which ultimately influences change in terms of what people can do or execute against. In an ideal world, I would say that's a combination of more than just learning. If I were to look at change management in one sentence, it's really a management of expectations plus accountabilities. So what am I expected? What am I expecting to see happen change? How am I expected to play a role? And then what am I accountable for? And when you get a successful equation between those two, people know what's coming, they aren't surprised, you get the most adoption and capabilities, and the execution is as planned as well and get the right results. So to me, it's really a mix of comms and learning. So that blend, when I was talking about the continuum, it used to be that comms was a newsletter and learning was an event. Albeit hopefully to Terry's point, they're going to be better events. Now it's more like drip marketing, where there's a more blurred line between information and learning and awareness and content. So to me, it's a mix of all the players who influence the way that people behave. But absolutely, without learning, change won't happen effectively, because that's really how people can learn something. Just thinking it. We were talking about mindset recently. I can have a skinny mindset, but if I don't stop eating pizza and I work out some more, I'm still going to be fat. So you've got to do more than think about something. You've got to actually take different behaviors and have different skills to apply to that.
Thank you, Carrie.
One of my favorite structures on thinking about org change, I've completely adopted a McKinsey lens on this. And one of their favorite models is to think about it through 4 lenses. One is driven by role modeling, right? So the leaders and colleagues and staff are behaving and driving the change. The second is around understanding and conviction. I understand why it's being asked of me and it actually makes sense, like cognitively. Then we get to confidence and skill building. I have the skills and opportunities to behave in the new way. And this is probably like the key place, but not the only place where learning and development ties into org change. And finally, reinforcement mechanisms. So this is the structures and the processes in the organization and the systems are actually encouraging and supporting the behavior we want to see. That is something that historically did not fall necessarily within the narrow lens of L&D, but more and more so gets added in and is another area of like competency and responsibility for organizations that are not just responsible for learning and development, but also for org development and change.
Thank you very, very much all. So sadly, we reached our final 5 minutes, and before thanking everyone for their time, panelists and attendees, I would like to ask all of you to just wrap up today's conversation with a punchline, words for eternity, key takeaway for our participants today. And I will pass the mic around Zoom clockwise, and I will ask you, Tali, to go first.
Oh, okay. Well then, never stop learning and growing. That is my punchline.
Thank you. Lara.
I was thinking that I would say, and learn for the future. So remember to learn to make a space for creativity with a focus on what may be needed later on.
So unlearn for the future.
And learn from the future, yeah.
Thank you. Kerry.
My prediction for what I think people need for 2021 is predictability. I think we have too much unpredictability. So if you can find a way to give people what they need when they need it in a way that feels somewhat familiar, I think you'll get more uptake and more consumption, and can reduce some of the anxiety of not feeling adequately prepared to execute.
So find a way to give people what they need when they need it.
Yes.
Thank you. Itamar.
One of my something I find myself saying more and more these days is never let a good crisis go to waste. You know, we are in choice on whether we want to look at this as a challenge or an opportunity. And I would invite all of us to think about it as the latter.
Thank you. And Teddy, would you wrap it up for us for today?
Certainly, I will say that learning is the new superpower. So leverage that superpower so that you can be resilient, relevant, bold, and thrive in the future of work.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Let's see if we have 2 more minutes. I was just checking for questions in the Q&A. So we can wrap it up for today with huge thanks to all of you for taking the time and the curiosity and for sharing your knowledge and your experiences. Please continue to stay with us throughout the conference. Hope to see you next year as panelists, as attendees, and thank you very, very much, all of you. And if the speakers would just take a few extra seconds for the after the event smiling photo, that would be awesome. Thank you very much, everyone. So I am trying to close the chat. Thank you all. It's been a joy. It's been a privilege. Thank you for the time before the event. Thank you for your time today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope we will stay connected and share more adventures from the future. And now let's say a big smiley hacking HR. Great. Thank you.
There was a question for the SHRM code, by the way, in the Q&A.
Okay, I will thank you for making me aware of that. I will retype the codes.
Really enjoyed learning from everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. And I will
Everyone.
I will reach out to you with a takeaway. Okay, so codes put there. Thank you. Take care. Enjoy your whatever moment of the day it is on your time zones.